Today, we're diving into a book that completely turned our understanding of a deeply personal act on its head. It's Emil Durkheim's 1897 study, Suicide. He made this wild argument that even our most private decisions, the ones we think are all our own, are actually shaped by huge social forces we can't even see. So let's get into it.
So right out of the gate, Durkheim just throws down this gauntlet, and it's a direct challenge to the way we instinctively think about this topic.
I mean, really think about that for a second. When we hear about suicide, our minds immediately jump to personal things, right? Psychology, private struggles, an individual's mental health. It just feels like the most individual, the most personal choice a person could possibly make.
But then Durkheim comes along in 1897 and makes this truly radical claim. He says, no, suicide isn't just a personal act. He argues it's what he called a social fact. It's a pattern that you can only understand by looking at the structure of society itself. So what in the world is a social fact? Well, for Durkheim, it's basically any kind of social pressure or pattern that exists outside of us as individuals, but still totally shapes how we behave. The key thing here, and this is really important, is that you can measure it. He wasn't trying to answer why John Doe took his life. He was asking, why do Protestants as a group have a different suicide rate than Catholics? See the difference? That's the huge sociological shift right there.
Okay, so to explain these patterns, Durkheim zeroes in on two key social forces that are always constantly pulling at us.
On one side, you've got social integration. This is all about how deeply connected you are to your community, your bonds to family, religion, your neighborhood, that kind of thing. On the other side, you have social regulation. That's about how much society's rules and norms guide your life, the whole moral framework that keeps our desires in check. For Durkheim, the suicide rate of any group boils down to the balance, or, the imbalance, of these two forces.
And this is where it gets really, really cool. Using just these two forces, he builds this incredibly elegant and powerful model that identifies four totally distinct types of suicide.
All right, this grid you're seeing, this is basically the heart of his entire theory. Think of it like a map with coordinates. You've got social integration on one axis, going from low to high, and then social regulation on the other, also low to high. Durkheim's big idea was that whenever one of these forces gets too weak or way too strong, it creates a very specific social environment that corresponds to a particular type of suicide. Let's break down each quadrant.
First up, in that low integration corner, you get egoistic suicide. This is what happens when people feel totally disconnected, isolated. They just don't have that sense of belonging to their community. And Durkheim's classic example, he pointed to the higher suicide rates among Protestants compared to Catholics, arguing that the Protestant faith, with its deep focus on individual conscience, actually leads to weaker social bonds.
Now flip that completely on its head and you get altruistic suicide. This is caused by way too much integration. Here, the individual is just completely swallowed up by the group, to the point where their own life feels kind of meaningless in comparison. Think of a soldier dying for their unit, or those historical examples of ritual sacrifice. It's all about the group's survival.
Then we've got anomic suicide, and this one comes from too little social regulation. This tends to pop up during times of really rapid disruptive change. And here's the crazy part. It could be an economic crash or a sudden economic boom. The old rules just don't seem to apply anymore, and people are left feeling completely adrift, without any real purpose. That state of normlessness, that's what Durkheim called anomie.
And finally, there's fatalistic suicide, caused by excessive regulation. This is the truly tragic situation where someone's life is so controlled, their future so completely blocked, that they just feel crushed by their destiny. Durkheim pointed to examples like slaves or prisoners, individuals living under this incredibly oppressive discipline with absolutely no hope of escape.
But here's the thing. This wasn't just some clever theory he dreamed up. Durkheim was dead set on proving it scientifically. So he turned to cold, hard data. And in the process, he basically pioneered a method that would define sociology for the next 100 years.
His approach was, for its time, absolutely revolutionary. First, he used what we call aggregate data. He wasn't looking at individual stories or journals, he was looking at statistical rates across entire populations. Then, and this is super important, he controlled variables. He'd compare, say, Protestants and Catholics living in the exact same region to make sure he wasn't just measuring geography. This let him systematically rule out other potential causes, things like genetics or even the weather, so he could zero in on the social forces he was really interested in.
Okay, so as groundbreaking as all this was, the theory isn't perfect. not by a long shot. Over the last century, other sociologists have poked some pretty significant holes in this classic study.
And probably the single biggest challenge, the one that really gets at the foundation of his work, is the data itself. Critics argue that official suicide statistics, well, they aren't objective facts at all. They are socially constructed.
I mean, think about it, right? A coroner has to make a subjective judgment call to label a death a suicide. A grieving family trying to avoid social stigma might put a lot of pressure on officials for a different cause of death to be put on the certificate. So what actually gets counted as suicide is the end result of all these human decisions and social pressures. And if the data itself is a social product, well then Durkheim's whole scientific argument could be built on some pretty shaky ground.
And there are other critiques, too. Some argue that his model is just too deterministic. It kind of treats people like they're passive puppets of these big social forces, and it totally ignores their own thoughts and feelings. Plus, you have to ask, are these huge categories like Protestant or unmarried really precise enough ways to measure something as complex as social integration?
So, okay, given all these valid criticisms, you might be wondering, why are we still talking about this book over a century later? Well, it's because despite all its flaws, its legacy is just massive.
Durkheim's work was a total game changer. He was the one who proved that even our most private acts follow clear social patterns. He established a powerful model for scientific social research. And he gave us these foundational concepts like anomie and social integration that researchers still use all the time today to study everything from online communities to public health.
In the end, maybe Durkheim's biggest contribution was forcing us all to look beyond ourselves and see these invisible social currents that guide our lives. And it really leaves you with a powerful question, doesn't it? What other choices you feel are purely your own, from your career path to your political beliefs, are being guided by forces you've never even noticed?